this episode, we talk with Helen Ball, Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Durham Infancy and Sleep Centre. Helen studies infant sleep and the parent-infant sleep relationship from a biosocial perspective. Broadly defined, her research examines sleep ecology of infants, young children and their parents. This encompasses attitudes and practices regarding infant sleep, behavioural and physiological monitoring of infants and their parents during sleep, infant sleep development, and the discordance between cultural sleep preferences and biological sleep needs. Helen has conducted research in hospitals and the community and contributes to national and international policy and practice guidelines on infant care. She pioneers the translation of academic research on infant sleep into evidence for use by parents and healthcare staff via BASIS, the Baby Sleep Information Source website. She serves as Associate Editor of the journal Sleep Health and is on the editorial board of the Journal of Human Lactation. And she is Chair of the Lullaby Trust Scientific Committee and an elected board member of the International Society for the Study and Prevention of Infant Deaths. In 2013, Helen received an award for outstanding impact in society from the Economic and Social Research Council. And in 2018, Durham University was awarded the Queen's Anniversary Prize for her research and outreach on parent-infant sleep. In this episode, you'll hear us talking with Helen about where on earth did the myths come which tell us we will do harm to our baby if we pick them up too much. And Rachel tells us what horrendous thing she was told with her first baby. Helen takes us on an anthropological look at motherhood and infancy. We find out where the well baby nurseries in hospitals came from. We discuss the old, current, and quite frankly, shocking SIDS safety messaging around the globe. Using a meat cleaver in bed with a baby to shock you out of bed sharing? Yes, you need to hear this. And find out how Helen played an incredibly crucial role ensuring that the UK and now many other countries actually discuss safe bed sharing with parents instead of a blanket rule against it. And in doing so, saving many a breastfeeding relationship and many parents' sanity. This episode has so many golden nuggets, you might just want to stay in and get your notebook out. First put the kettle on and settle in. You are going to love this. But just a sec, before we start on this epic episode, if you love the show and want more from Rachel and me, then head on over to our websites and check out all the courses, books, collectives a go-go. You'll find all the details and occasional discount deals on the old Instagram at The Midwife's Cauldron, or, of course, in the show notes below. And if you really, really love the show, please consider two things: a single or a monthly donation over on Patreon, or even buy me a coffee. And remember, that review you leave on your podcast host really makes a difference in who listens in. Thank you for your support. We just love having you bubbling away with us. I'm Katie James, and this is the Midwife's Cauldron podcast. Each episode, I'm joined by my incredible co-host, Dr. Rachel Reed. Listen in as we hubble, bubble, toil and trouble our way through aspects of womanhood, midwifery, birth and lactation. So go on, subscribe now, and hear us on your favourite podcast host. A very good morning to you, Professor Helen Ball. It is an absolute pleasure to have you with us today in the Cauldron with me and Rachel. So welcome on this very chilly morning.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's very cold up here in the northeast. So I wish I was in Brisbane.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh no, it's 86 degrees humidity here. It's pretty gross.
I was there in 2017. At that time of year, this in a kind of like end of December, January, February. I loved it. I like the weather.
Well, both of us, well, you'll hear Rachel definitely hails from the Northeast, and we studied together at Newcastle, did our midwifery at the RVI. And God, I remember those mornings walking up from, where was I? Down at the quayside in Uni Digs. And it was about a 45-minute walk. And I'd have about 6 layers on. And I'd just take them off gradually as I went up that hill to the hospital. And I'd get there with just 1 layer on because I'd walked so quickly. But coming from London, God, that northeast wind. I don't miss it, that's for sure. Helen, you came into our lives when we students in, as I say, Newcastle in the RVI, the Royal Victoria Infirmary. And as we started our placement, you were there already studying. So it feels amazing. This is like 22 years ago. We've eventually come back together and we get to speak to you. So that feels rather nice.
Makes me feel rather old.
Sorry. Helen, can I ask you, because you have an interesting background in how you've got here, and I would love our audience to know a little bit more about you and how you came into this field of research from your background, really, of anthropology.
Okay, then. Well, I started my career as a primatologist. So I did my PhD studying monkeys in the Caribbean, and thought for a few years after I'd finished my PhD that that's what I'd probably carry on studying all my life. But by the time I got the job in Durham, I'd already had my first daughter, and I hadn't imagined, so I'd done my PhD in the US, and I hadn't imagined really that I would be moving back to the UK. But this job in Durham came up, and it really fit with all of my background and training. So I applied for it and got it, and then found myself in the northeast of England with a field site that was, 4,000 miles away on the other side of the world, and a small child who didn't want me to leave them for extended periods of time, and trying to work out how to continue to do primatology and be an academic in the northeast of England. After a very hectic summer, chasing monkeys from 7 in the morning until 7 in the evening, and then going home to my daughter and husband, who had spent the day on the beach in San Juan, made me decide that actually I didn't want to keep doing that anymore. I was missing out on all the fun, and that I needed to switch what I was studying. Wow. So I started to think about what I could study in the northeast of England, given the training that I'd had to that point. And there was another anthropologist called James McKenna in the States who was making a bit of a splash studying mother-baby sleep. And I knew that he had been a primatologist before he started doing that. And I thought, I could do that. Nobody's doing that in the UK. So that could be what I switched to studying. And serendipitously, as I was a mum of a young child, and then very shortly had another one, I knew lots of new mums. So it seemed like a perfect way to combine what was going on in family life with my academic training and interests. So I'd gotten interested in infant sleep, obviously, as you do, having your first child. And so that just kind of became the thing that I studied, for various reasons, which I'm sure we'll talk about shortly.
Fabulous. Thank you. God. Oh, primatologist. That was always on my list as well, but I didn't quite make it there. So I'm feeling kind of like, a bit jealous.
We all grew up wanting to be Jane Goodall, I think.
Don't we all? No, exactly. It seems so idyllic. But yes. And then you came into infant sleep.
Yeah.
So as an anthropologist, how do you approach how and what we do as in terms of infant sleep differently to, say, me as a midwife who would then go into study infant sleep, or the other research, because there is a difference.
Definitely. So my background's, trained me in evolutionary biology. and behaviour. So that's the way in which I was thinking about infant sleep before I ever started studying it. So that means kind of anthropologists take a comparative approach to a lot of the things that we do, and that means studying cross-culturally, but it also means studying cross-species, which is obviously what I've been doing as a primatologist. And if you think about humans as just, animals like all other animals, we're mammals, and our mammalian biology expects certain things to happen in infant development. It unfolds in a certain way. And the way it unfolds for primates is that babies have a long gestation period and they're born relatively well developed. And immediately after birth, they can cling to their moms and they stay with their mothers 24/7 while she forages, while she sleeps, etc., etc. And they feed at will whenever they want to. And primate mothers produce milk that's high in sugar, provides babies with energy, but it's not got a lot of fat in it, and it doesn't satiate babies for a very long period, like, say, the milk of other kinds of mammals who put their babies in nests and leave them for long periods. So, like, rabbits and mice and even cats and dogs. So we're, primates are born with a certain set of characteristics that sort of dictates the way in which they're cared for. And when you think about human babies, humans are obviously primates too. We're mammals too. We produce milk for our babies. And milk is the same kind of milk as that of other primates. It provides energy, but it doesn't provide a lot of fat, so it doesn't satiate babies for a long time. Human babies are born with well-developed sensory organs. We can see, we can hear, we can call, but what we can't do is what a lot of other similar mammals can do, which is to stand up shortly after birth and follow our mums. And we can't do what other primates do, which is cling to our mothers and help ourselves stay with her. So we have to be taken care of, we have to be carried, we have to be transported. So anthropologists have labelled human babies as being unusually helpless, precocial mammals. So primates are precocial. Humans are supposed to be precocial, but something's happened in our evolutionary history that has caused us to be unusually helpless at birth. And being unusually helpless, but having precocial characteristics like the kind of milk that we feed on, has and puts constraints on the way in which human babies expect to be cared for, I suppose, what the biological kind of expectations are. So for me, a human baby needs close contact for safety, for warmth, needs frequent feeding because the milk that they expect to receive doesn't satiate them for long periods, and would expect to sleep in close contact with its mother, would not expect to be put down and left somewhere because of their incredible vulnerability and helplessness. So that's what really informed my view of what infant sleep ought to be like. And then what I was interested in finding out was, given what I knew about kind of evolutionary biology, what were parents actually doing? How were they actually coping with that incredibly vulnerable baby who didn't want to be left for 8 hours at night while the parents went to sleep? What was going on in the homes of northern England, the northern English? Because we know around the world, there are hugely variable ways of looking after babies, but the vast majority of babies are in contact with a caregiver most of the time.
Absolutely. And we seem to have lost those roots.
Mm-hmm.
In most cultures, particularly in Western cultures, like you say. How have we got to this point? How are we in the place where we are now, where it's seen as, we still hear the mother, the grandmother, the mother-in-law say, put that baby down. That baby doesn't need to be carried again. We still are competing with are you feeding again? Particularly once we get past the 3 or 4 month stage in certain countries where it's seen as a bit, oh, really? You're still breastfeeding?
Yeah.
Can I tell you what I was told with my first baby?
Oh, yeah.
I was told in the hospital that I needed to stop picking him up so much because I'd bruise him.
Wow.
Oh, my God.
Wow. I've never heard of a baby getting bruised by being held.
And was he, Rachel? Did you bruise him? Is he still bruised? What, 30 years
No.
later? That's
Yeah,
incredible.
those ideas that we have in places like the UK and the States and Australia about what babies need are really quite recent, to be honest. They don't go back more than 100 or, well, now we're kind of like 100 years ago is like the 1920s, so we should say 150 maybe years ago, the middle of the 1800s. You can read historical accounts of advice for mothers written in the 1800s, and they were saying all of the things that we've just talked about. The bosom of the bosom of the mother is the natural pillow of the baby, and babies should sleep with their mothers until they're weaned at around 9 months of age, and all of that kind of all of those things that you see in other cultures where they treat vulnerable, helpless babies as vulnerable, helpless babies, not as little mini adults who can survive by themselves. So a lot of these ideas that we have in English-speaking Western societies arose around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. Some of them are to do with, Victorian attitudes. Some of them came in a bit later with behavioral psychologists, such as John B. Watson, who was kind of very famous for giving lectures. He came to England and gave lots of lectures about not mollycoddling children, about treating babies in the way in which you want them to become citizens of your country. So, independent, self-reliant, all of those kinds of things were they were words that were attached to child rearing. And people bought into all of this stuff because it was considered scientific and new and progressive. And, psychology was a very popular discipline, kind of like the insights that were being shared from psychological research at that time, were new and exciting, and people wanted to follow all of this stuff. But I think people like John B. Watson did untold damage to relationships between parents and babies for many generations. And his own children, if you read, you can find on the internet the accounts of his own children's lives. They spent many years in therapy afterwards as a consequence of the way in which he implemented or insisted that his children were treated. But the influence of people like him, and also less extreme historical figures like Truby King from New Zealand, who was a physician, very, very enthusiastic about breastfeeding, wanted babies to be treated, exposed to the natural world, I suppose, treated in what he considered to be a natural way, which meant putting them outside in nature and leaving them in their prams at the bottom of the garden for hours and feeding them on a very strict schedule, which is not natural at all. but a lot of those ideas are, a lot of his ideas are where the not picking the baby up too frequently because you'll spoil it comes from, and crying being good for baby's lungs.
Oh, yeah,
They
that's a
need to
great
get
one.
fresh air into their lungs, and there were a lot of things happening in the 20s and the 30s that still influence the ways in which parents and grandparents talk about what babies need these days.
It's just like, how are we still doing things from 150 years ago and 100 years ago, and it's just replicating, and you hear the same sayings going on. It's fascinating, really, and crazy that we do this. And yet, as a midwife, and I'm a lactation consultant, it's, I work with so many women, and for however many years now, and they may come to me because breastfeeding's not going so well, and often, like, I might get to the end point of what they want or what's been going on. They say, oh, well, I've read this book, and then they've started this strict schedule, and they're listening to other advice, and really what you finally get out of them is that they go, oh, this makes me feel absolutely awful. I'm like, it hurts me every time I do this, and I don't want to do it, but it's just so ingrained that they have to get to this point, and yet they're hurting themselves.
We stopped listening to our bodies, and we stopped listening to our babies.
Absolutely.
And we started listening to male experts.
Yes.
And
not just in infant sleep.
Yeah.
I was going to say that begins well before babies arrive, unfortunately.
Yes, it does. It's just part of a much bigger picture.
Completely.
With obstetricians taking over childbirth and everything. But
and I wanted to ask you, because you talk about on your fantastic website that I've actually used for my entire career, actually, particularly when I really specialized in the postpartum area and breastfeeding and lactation. And it was called it's called Basis now, which is a fantastic repository for both healthcare professionals and for parents and mums and grandparents and anyone who I could get to read it. And I'd tell them certain pages to go to, because depending on how much capability their brain had to absorb the information. I love how you talk on there, and you really explain just what we often talk about, and Rachel has written about and spoken about, in terms of when we brought in sort of the pain relief for women in birth, and how this was the beginning of the Well Baby nurseries. And for me, that was fascinating, because I always kind of wondered, why do we have these? Where has this come from? Why would we take babies away from their mums? But it makes so much sense. So I'd love you to expand on that a bit more for us.
Well, based on the reading that I did when I was kind of like trying to figure out how all of this came about, it began, in the Victorian era again. And we know, I mean, Queen Victoria was you could say, a victim of this herself, because she was terrified of childbirth, because her cousin had died during childbirth, and many Victorian women were. Many Victorian women did die during childbirth, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Some to do with poor nutrition and rickets and deformed pelvises and stuff like that, but also because people didn't understand about infection control and that sort of thing. But there were many campaigns launched around this era about trying to make childbirth less painful and less scary for women. And chloroform was the anaesthetic that generally was used at the time.
Dear God.
But to access chloroform, you had to have your baby in a hospital. So the advent of kind of, and it was presented by the suffragettes and the women's rights movement as a right for women to not suffer pain and fear during childbirth, which it seems completely legitimate. But it propelled women into hospitals to have babies. And of course, when you've had chloroform as an anaesthetic. It's not mild. It completely knocks you out, incapacitates you. And the subsequent analgesia that were invented did the same sort of thing. Women had to be scopolamine and morphine, I think, were a particularly interesting combination that knocked you out and caused you to forget the horrors. But you were so incapacitated, you had to be tied to the bed because you'd just kind of like fall off and injure yourself. So mothers were, unable, basically, having had these rudimentary anesthetics in childbirth, they were unable to take care of their babies. So, and for several days, so babies were removed to what they considered to be a safe place, which was the baby nursery, so that they could be observed, because these anesthetics also affected the babies. They depressed their breathing, etc. So they had to be observed by nurses who took care of them. And of course, they had to feed them something. Formula was kind of like the new great thing. So babies were fed formula by nurses for several days while their mothers kind of not really recovered from childbirth, but recovered from the anesthesia that they'd had during childbirth before they were able to take care of them. So baby nurseries came about because babies needed to be looked after women had had this kind of very heavy form of anesthesia. And then as new anesthetics were developed that, didn't require women to be knocked out or unconscious for days and take days of recovery, baby nurseries began to be rebranded as being necessary for infection control. So babies had to be kept in a sterile environment in the 50s. And, mothers could only have them to feed them, and then they had to go straight back to the nursery.
And then, I mean, most of us probably listening and we've seen in the research in terms of when we take babies away from their mums to give them more sleep and the babies to settle, we know that the mums don't have more sleep, and they often will wake up to hearing any baby crying because they're worried it's their own, which actually just compounds the whole lack of sleep, not getting breastfeeding off to a good start. And we still see it, not so much in the UK, and not so much since really the baby friendly.
The baby friendly has made sure that babies are kept in the mother's rooms, but certainly in the US there are still lots of baby nurseries. People have to fight to keep hold of their own babies after they've delivered.
Absolutely.
But then even then, what we're doing is, for example, most women do have medical births. So we have women who have had a cesarean left in a room by themselves with the baby, unable to get to it, with no support in there. And they're terrified. I remember working on postnatal wards and the buzzers continually going off with panicking mothers and choking babies on all the mucus. And it's, this is just not, you would have family members there. You would have somebody supporting you, caring for your baby.
You were never left alone before births became medicalized. You were always surrounded by your female relatives. So the way in which we give birth and the artificial environment that we've created for mums and babies in the early postnatal period is really a strange thing to do for a mother and baby immediately after birth. But it takes quite a lot of effort to get people to see that sometimes, because it's become so normalized in our culture.
Yes. I still remember, even in the last few years, being asked by parents of the new mum, when will you take this baby away? Why is this baby not being taken away? And it's like, oh, well, we do rooming in, and this is going to help support breastfeeding and skin to skin contact. But then that kind of brings us to, or makes me question, is this where we have, how do I put this? In terms of looking at SIDS, or sudden infant death syndrome, and looking at the messaging that then went out in terms of we have a problem, We are seeing a high incidence of this. And I know in the UK, there was in the early 90s a campaign called Back to Sleep, which had a huge impact in reducing the number of babies dying from SIDS. And I just wonder whether this sort of separation and the way that we give birth and our culture has an impact in what we're seeing with SIDS, or whether this is separate, and where we're at with that. Really, this is a very big question, not well asked at all, because my brain's going in different directions at the moment.
Yeah, so this was really one of the things that key thing that I was interested in when I started this research, because that was the messaging that I had also received when I had my children, was that bed sharing was dangerous, that SIDS reduction in the 90s was so my eldest daughter was born in 92, my youngest in 97. And SIDS messaging in the 90s was kind of a top priority in public health. SIDS rates, in Western countries had been quite high. I mean, all of these things we have to put in perspective, I suppose. So there were about 2,000 babies dying, between 2,000 and 2,500 babies a year dying of this thing that was labelled SIDS, but nobody actually knew what was killing them in the UK or in England and Wales. And that seemed, incredibly high. And they wanted the rates of that to come down. And obviously parents who lost their babies were very keen to see something done about the high rate of SIDS. But, in a global from a global perspective, it's a phenomenon of a country that has eliminated all other causes of infant death, really, to be able to know what your SIDS rate is, because, if you live in some place with, say, malaria killing millions of babies a year, you don't notice the handful who might, die suddenly and unexpectedly for no known cause, infections, or, you have to have gotten rid of infections to be able to have the luxury, if you like, of SIDS, which sounds quite callous, but in a global perspective, that's how it is. So anyway, these campaigns were launched in most Western societies to try and reduce sudden unexpected deaths. And the key thing, as you've mentioned already, was putting babies on their backs to sleep, and that seemed to work. SIDS rates started to fall in all places that had that implemented back to sleep campaigns. And of course, because that was successful, then epidemiologists were on the lookout for, what was the next thing, and what's the next thing that we can tell parents will help avoid babies dying. And as the research was conducted, one of the things that came out as a risk factor, besides things like smoking and babies overheating, etc., was babies sleeping with another person, co-sleeping, was found to increase the risk of SIDS, not as much as some of the other things, but it was definitely identified in multiple studies as a risk. And so people started to include it in the safe sleep guidance, that if you avoided co-sleeping, like you avoided exposing your baby to smoke and you avoided putting your baby on its front, it would, inevitably lead to fewer deaths. But there was a problem with that. And the problem with that was that, well, there's several problems with it, but a key problem with it was that putting babies on their backs and avoiding smoke exposure and many of the other SIDS messages really didn't come with any detrimental consequences. But avoiding co-sleeping does have detrimental consequences for some people. Yes. And one of the groups of people I was particularly interested in at the time was breastfeeding mothers, because our research had found that breastfeeding mothers had a disproportionate tendency to sleep with their babies, more than kind of like non-breastfeeding mothers. And that was because of the biological reasons that I talked about at the beginning, most often because of the frequency of nighttime feeding, and the baby's desire to be with the mother for safety and warmth, and the fact that to be able to breastfeed for the recommended 6 months, you have to manage to do it in a way that preserves your sanity and your sleep. So a lot of mothers just bring their babies into bed for those nighttime feeds, and the baby ends up staying there. That was the research that we conducted. The very first research that we conducted was, what are parents doing with their babies at night? Who are they and why are they doing it? And it was very, very clear that in the UK, at least, the vast majority of people who brought their babies into bed did so, or started doing so for breastfeeding reasons. So I can remember going to a SIDS conference. It was in Peterhouse College in Cambridge in about 1998, I'm going to say, 98 or 99. And it was after we had done this first piece of research demonstrating why parents bed shared and what the benefits were to breastfeeding mothers and babies. And I stood up and I talked about this research, and I said that the SIDS guidance telling everybody that they must never bed share was counterproductive, and that its ultimate consequence was going to be to undermine breastfeeding, and that was going to lead to more negative outcomes, and that there had to be some balance in the guidance, because it wasn't there wasn't one single important issue here to be addressed, which was reducing SIDS. There were multiple competing interests going on, and they couldn't just proceed with this one topic agenda. And some people were really pleased to hear me say that, and other people were absolutely furious.
I could imagine.
Say that, because it didn't fit the narrative that they wanted to pursue. And so there ensued really a battle, I think, within the SIDS epidemiology world. And I wasn't considered an epidemiologist. I was just a young anthropologist. So a lot of them thought, what does she know, and why are we listening to her? Why is anybody listening to her?
Oh no.
So it took a long time. It was like trying to turn an ocean liner. But we've eventually got there.
Yeah.
But one of the strongest memories that I have of that day was after I'd given my talk. I went to coffee, so there was coffee in between the sessions, and I was stood there balancing my cup of coffee, and people kept coming up to me, and they, some of them were wanting to persuade me that I was wrong, and other people were kind of like talking about how interesting it was. And I felt this tap on my arm, and there was an elderly gentleman at the conference, and he was a very eminent pathologist, and he had been one of the key movers in the SIDS world in the UK. His name was Professor John Emery, and he was in his 80s at this point. And he patted me on the arm, and he said, "I can see you're very busy, my dear, and I don't want to interrupt. I just wanted to say, keep doing what you're doing. You're doing very well. Keep doing it." And then he wandered off. And that was such a validating experience in the middle of all of these people who were quite defensive about being criticized or having their worldview challenged. That it propelled me for a long time.
Oh, and thank God it did, actually.
Yeah.
Because I love that. It's so nice that and to get someone like that to just those little gestures sometimes that they give you that spark to go, I'm on the right track. I can do this. And you just have to keep going back to that point of going,
That's
oh no,
right. Yeah,
I'm on,
that's
because
right.
when it's like you're treading water, you're trying to climb up.
Yeah.
I mean, like you mentioned James McKenna earlier, and I've been at talks where he's shown the messaging in Canada, I think it was. And, you know, they had a big campaign, I think it was the early 2000s, where you will know this, Helen, as well, where they had pictures of babies in beds with like a butcher's knife, a machete or something next to them, covered in blood, showing like what's more dangerous for your baby. Like it was
a
absolutely
Milwaukee.
That's where it was.
Yeah. It was putting your baby in bed with you to sleep is the same as putting them in bed with a big meat cleaver. Mother's body as meat cleaver, as mother's body as lethal weapon.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So, I mean, the messaging in the Western countries has just been horrendously scary, vilifying what is a natural process. And so what we've done to like innate reflexes as mammals, as primates, as humans, is we have just completely severed these ties of being able to listen to our instincts in every corner, from the minute you're pregnant, going into labor and birth, and then afterwards being given all these messaging. You said the other week about Rachel, I'm more shocked that women are able to birth in our system. I'm more shocked that women can actually continue to breastfeed, that the ones that can, with the type of messaging and support that we initiate their transition into motherhood with.
Yeah, it always seemed completely perverse to me that we give them so much encouragement to breastfeed, yet we make it so difficult for them right from the get-go.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the point of the research that I was doing in the RVI all those years ago, was, you know, taking babies away from mothers is one thing, but people thought that putting babies in the same room would fix that. But even that small separation, you know, between the mother's bed and the baby's cot, that made it difficult for the baby to alert her when it was ready to feed, that made it difficult for C-section mums to be able to pick their babies out of the cot by themselves. All of those things just, you know, put barrier after barrier in the way of initiating and establishing breastfeeding.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've lost Rachel, but she might come back in. She's expecting a storm and the internet. Right. She has a huge internet like antenna, but it doesn't do any help. I thought she's been in that position a while, but no, she is. She's back. I was just explaining that you hadn't just left and gone, I'm done here, fed up with this talk.
No. What did I miss? That's the first time I've been kicked out completely of the internet on a podcast.
Oh, you've missed the most important insights. And, you know, I said the most interesting things while you were away.
Yeah, you did.
Oh, no.
You will.
I'll have to listen to the podcast, won't I, to find out.
Oh, God. Where were we? I want to talk about your research and just explain the type of research that you have done in terms of us separating babies. And for us, I remember coming in, you know, as brand new student. I'd been in the community for 6 months before they let us loose in the hospital, so to speak, and going on the postnatal ward. And you had video or camera equipment up, watching the mothers. And I believe, and I might be wrong because it has been a while, I believe it was looking at if we put clip-on cots or bed sharing and side cots compared to mums whose babies were in the cots within the hospital environment.
Yeah.
And I think that was the study that we were.
Yeah, it was a randomized trial. It was the first randomized trial that we did, and we subsequently did 3. What we were interested in was what happened to mother-baby behavior when mothers and babies were in close contact with one another versus separated simply by the wall of the bassinet, because the normal bassinets were pushed right up next to the mother's bed. but mum and baby couldn't touch each other easily.
Mm.
They were always too high for the beds, really.
Yes.
So babies couldn't alert mums when they, were quiet but awake and wanted to feed. They had to get into screaming mode for the mum to know. And mums couldn't easily retrieve their babies. They had to kind of get up, kneel on the bed or get out of bed or press the buzzer or whatever to have somebody help them get the baby. So it was actually, so many things happened at that conference in Cambridge. But it was actually that conference in Cambridge, one of the people that I was talking to was Martin Ward-Platt, who was a consultant neonatologist, and he had oversight of the postnatal ward at the RVI. And I said, what I'd really like to do is video the difference in feeding behaviour between mums and babies who are bed sharing and mums and babies who aren't. Jim McKenna had already videoed what he'd really studied was polysomnography of the sleep of mothers and babies who slept together and slept apart, and he'd done it in a sleep lab. And I didn't have a sleep lab at that time, and what I wanted to do was look at feeding behaviour, given the previous research that I've done and the importance of feeding with bed sharing. And I said, but I can't randomise mums and babies at home because I can't make them sleep in certain conditions. I said, but do you think we could do it in a hospital? Do you think we could randomly allocate them to receive a different kind of bed or cot after birth? And Martin was such a lovely man, and he said, I think we might be able to do that. And that started kind of like a many decades collaboration between us and Martin at the RVI, doing these studies to look at what happened when you put babies in bed with mums immediately after birth. For the first, in those days, babies and mums and babies stayed in hospital for a couple of days. So we videoed them on the first and second postnatal nights. Some of them randomly allocated to have their babies in bed, some of them with a sidecar or clip-on crib attached, and some of them with normal rooming in the bassinet. And we just gave them a remote control, and they turned the camera on when they were ready to settle down for the night and turned it off again in the morning. And then we coded the videos and looked at feeding behaviour and found out that it made a huge amount of difference if mothers and babies could touch each other compared to simply being separated by the wall of that bassinet in terms of how frequently they fed during the night. So that kind of like started me on, a whole load of projects looking at kind of what the relationship between sleeping and feeding was.
And yet we still have those fish tanks as standard in hospitals, don't we?
Well, up in Brisbane, I believe you have got Janine Young, who has been implementing another version of the sidecar crib, not the one that we use because they don't make that anymore, but something called the MABIM in the hospitals, in some of the hospitals in Brisbane, or the Sunshine Coast. She's at the University of the Sunshine Coast now. She used to be at the University of Brisbane.
That's where I used to work. Yes, I know Janine. I've worked with her. Yeah, I think she was doing a project in Sunshine Coast in Brisbane.
Yeah. So, and she's got another one. She's working with some people down in Canberra doing a similar thing. So, I think these things are gradually spreading, but it's difficult to get the research funding to do stuff like this because half the people go, oh, no, we don't need that.
Yeah.
That's not important. And half the people go, well, it's obvious. Why do you need to do a study to demonstrate it? So I have found over the years trying to get money to do this kind of research, it's on the one hand, it's not novel to some people, it's common sense, and to other people, it's not important. So trying to make the case for why they should fund it when there are so many other things that they've got calls, on the research money, can take quite a long time.
Yeah, and hence we're still in this sort of predicament of 24, 25 years later, we still wrap these babies up and we put them in their fish tanks. And we wonder why what's going on in terms of breastfeeding and frequency and feeding cues, and
absolutely
mums and parents just not learning the basic feeding cues because they're not in this close contact, so they're not actually just responding as you would without thinking. They have to think and then respond, or they put a dummy in the baby's mouth and then the baby's like, oh, okay, I'm soothed now because I'm wrapped up like a burrito and I'll actually go off, and you've missed a feed, and the impacts of that for future successful milk
and we
volumes.
tell parents that they need to do responsive feeding, but we don't give them the tools to do it or explain what that might look like. So they think, if they put their baby in the cot and they have the baby monitor on, and as soon as they hear the baby cry on the baby monitor, they go and they retrieve it and they feed it. That's being responsive. But we're talking about a whole different level of responsiveness is what supports breastfeeding.
It feels like we still have quite a lot of mixed messaging, even though the messaging for safe sleeping in terms of SIDS and the UK messaging was that it took an approach where it wasn't just a blanket ban of co-sleeping must never happen, and don't smoke, don't sleep with your baby if you've had alcohol. But you looked at the research, you looked at what was really happening, and I believe there was research where about 2/3 of women actually said, I found myself that I've just woken up in bed with my baby anyway. I didn't plan to do it. And to ignore the fact that so many women are doing this in order to breastfeed, and then we actually don't give them a way of safely sleeping or any guidance, was crazy. And you were part of bringing in that messaging of saying, do you know what? We actually need to support the women because this is happening whether you like it or not. We need to look at what is safe co-sleeping, because naturally, hundreds of years ago and in other cultures, it happens. But however, we do drug ourselves up during birth and labor, and we do medicalize it, and we have all these other issues going on. We need to make it as safe as possible. But you didn't ignore the fact that this is going on, and that was the first change in the world, was in the UK, I believe.
I think you're probably right. Yes. So one of the arguments that we managed to get some traction with was the argument that we've demonstrated, we've shown in multiple studies now, that people bring their babies into bed, and that they have their babies in bed for a wide variety of reasons. One of those, the most predominant one of those probably, is breastfeeding. And those women need to have information about how to breastfeed safely, how to bed share safely, because you're not going to get them to stop doing it. But then there are also other reasons that parents, we discovered that parents bring their babies into bed, some more safe, some less safe, but all of these people needed information, and we argued that it was actually unethical to withhold information about how to avoid dangerous circumstances. What were the dangerous circumstances, and what did how could you make your bed safer? And we had been videoing mums and babies sleeping together in the hospital, in the home, in our sleep lab when I got Durham University to set us up a sleep lab. And we had demonstrated that breastfeeding mums and babies sleep together in a very, very distinctive way. And it, provides a number of apparent safety benefits that people worry about with respect to SIDS. And therefore, teaching women, and especially non-breastfeeding women who might not do this instinctively, how to sleep with their babies safely, could be hugely, important in terms of reducing SIDS anyway. So it was kind of a missed opportunity to not share that information. And gradually over time, people began, I was going to say people began to change their minds. And I don't know how many people actually changed their minds, or whether it was just a generational thing. And eventually one generation that had been dominant in the SIDS world in the UK sort of gave way to the next generation, and the next generation kind of was a bit less dogmatic about never bed sharing. But whatever the kind of like the personality dynamics were around all of that, it started to shift around 2014. And in 2014, there was a NICE review, the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence, were asked actually by the Minister for Health to review the evidence on co-sleeping and bed sharing and what health professionals in the UK should be saying. And this was as a consequence of a study that had been published by one of the influential SIDS statisticians. He wasn't an epidemiologist, he was a statistician, in 2013, that claimed to demonstrate that there was a 5-fold increased risk of SIDS with bed sharing. But the data had been analysed in quite a strange way, and there were numerous bits of information that had been imputed in the study because they hadn't collected the data. And, you know, it caused a lot of discussion and debate about whether this 5 times increased risk was really real. And as a consequence, this review was done, and I was one of the people who was on this panel, along with lots of other clinicians and experts, etc. And at the beginning, we were each asked to kind of say what was our perspective on this topic, and I said, well, I'd like to explain why mothers bed share. As a bed sharing mother myself, and as an anthropologist who has studied this in great detail, I'd like to talk to you about what the advantages are to us of doing this. And at the end of the whole discussion, they came to the conclusion that parents should be it was a topic where parents should be making informed choices. It shouldn't be one where there was dogmatic guidance being given, because it affected different people in different ways. People did it for different reasons. There were different outcomes involved. And they reviewed all of those case control studies and couldn't find any clear evidence that co-sleeping increased SIDS. So that was the start of the change of the UK guidance. And it's kind of gathered momentum since then, and now we have national guidance that doesn't tell parents that they should never bed share. It tells parents what hazardous bed sharing entails, or hazardous co-sleeping, because it's not just in a bed. And then it shows them what safe bed sharing looks like, and talks to them about things to think about to make bed sharing as safe as possible, which I think is a huge step forward. It's not without its critics. There are still people here who would like to see that go away.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But, you know, I think one of the things that I think really helped was the fact that the UNICEF Baby Friendly Initiative and Lullaby Trust were able to come together to agree on a set of guidance which satisfied the SIDS world and satisfied the breastfeeding community.
Yes, I mean, you made great strides there. It's made a huge difference, and other countries followed that work and that messaging. It might have taken a while, but it started to make a difference for a lot of countries and a lot of people around the world. So fantastic work, because the importance of just like keeping mums and babies together at points where they want to breastfeed is so paramount. I mean, babies feed so frequently through the night.
Of course. Yeah.
And you're exhausted. And there is this dogma of, you know, if you breastfeed, you're going to have less sleep, you're going to have worse sleep, so you need to formula feed. And, you know, you looked into that in terms of the frequency of feeding and the location of where people feed and the differences between feeding types.
Yeah. And breastfeeding mothers don't get less sleep. They get about the same amount of sleep, but it's more fragmented. They wake up more frequently. And I think preparing women for that, so that they know that this is normal and that they can find strategies like bringing the baby into bed or sharing, expressing and letting their partner feed some of the night feeds. There are ways in which you can make that nighttime breastfeeding easier, but you need to be aware of them before you start, so that you don't hit that crisis point and just decide, I'm giving up.
Yeah, I think your work has played a huge role in my career and the information I've been giving. I feel like I'm hearing the words that I've been reading about and the leaflets that I've been giving out for 20 years and saying, go here. It's just marvelous. And I really appreciate what you've done, because I think it's been a big battle, and I'm really grateful that pat on the arm kept you going.
Yes.
Because where would we be?
I think it's also been at the luxury of being an academic, kind of doing this rather than a health professional. And I think it would have been a lot more difficult for me to have been as outspoken about it as I was able to be as a health professional. I think that bit of academic freedom, that you're expected to kind of like say what your research has found and speak truth to power, if you like. As I've been in a privileged position being able to do that. I'm not going to get fired by somebody who dislikes what I'm doing. But this is what they want me to do as an academic. So I've been encouraged to put my money where my mouth is in a lot of respects and try to create impact out of my research and get it out there in the real world. So probably wouldn't have happened if I'd been in a different kind of career.
Rachel, have you got any other questions?
No, that was just fascinating for me, because it's not kind of a topic that I guess I've looked at for a long time. Yeah, there's lots to think about.
Well, have a look at what Janine's been doing with the state of Queensland SIDS guidelines, because she's quite dramatically overhauled those as well. They're now a risk minimisation approach, not a risk elimination. So yeah. Queensland's the first state in Australia to follow the UK.
And that's been going on a long time, because I remember I worked at the Sunshine Coast Hospital, and I remember talking about that and being with meetings in like the Queensland cluster, talking about that. And I haven't been in Queensland for 10 years now. So at least, that has not happened overnight either.
She's been doing a lot of work behind the scenes on that for a long time.
It's a big battle for anyone working in this field. Unfortunately, it shouldn't be.
No.
But it is. I wanted to bring you on, Helen, because I think because you've been part of my work for 22 years and it was like, oh, I wonder if I could get Helen on. And it was just really exciting for me, because I just knowing that when you've really been, I'm just so grateful, and you've just been part of my care that I've been able to provide. And I want to share that with the midwives and the birth workers that listen to us, and also make sure that people go on to the basis.co.uk. I will get the right details in the show notes. But I also want to mention one more thank you, because I just saw this last night and wasn't aware of it before, have to admit, that you also have a photo doc library.
Yeah, an image archive. Yeah.
An image archive, yes, of correct bed sharing. And where I live currently, there is an image at the moment from a health insurance company, and you have to have health insurance here by law. And their image has been there for a month and a half, and I am going to write to them, because I keep meaning to, and I see it on the bus, but by the time I get home, I've forgotten. And it's not my own health insurance provider. And there is a dad on a sort of sofa, like one of those really big sofas, asleep, and the baby's on the sofa next to him, asleep. Image of co-sleeping on a bed surface, and I'm infuriated. And so now I saw this last night and went, oh my goodness, there's stock imagery that is there to stop this thing happening. So I will be doing my best German, putting it through the translator and writing that email today.
Well, we created that image archive for a very similar reason, because there was an article in the BMJ talking about co-sleeping. In fact, it was talking about, I think, response to the NICE guidance, and the picture that they illustrated it with was of hazardous co-sleeping. And I was furious. And I'm like, find a better picture. This is absolutely irresponsible to talk about changing the guidance and then show a picture of hazardous bed sharing. This is what people are going to think bed sharing looks like. So they did. They changed it quite quickly after I got in touch. But then I'm like, but they did struggle to find a picture. Yeah. So I was like, right, we need pictures so that people can't say in future that they're struggling to find a picture. So
exactly. So that is a blooming awesome resource. Oh, we have little puppy Esther come to visit.
This is who I co-sleep with.
Puppy co-sleep. Very similar to my puppy. We've got a multi-poo. What's yours?
Oh, she's mostly poodle. A little bit of...
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, mine's the same colour and got the same kind of curly hair.
Oh,
yeah.
And she also sleeps with us too.
Oh, I think it's hazard sleeping. She gets under the covers and burrows right down. So I worry that she's probably not getting enough oxygen through the night. But anyway.
We digress. We could talk about monkeys and dogs.
Yeah,
I need to do another podcast because that interests me a hell of a lot. Well, I think this has been, well, for me, it's been an absolute treat. And I think for Rachel as well, to have you with us, Helen, today and give us some insights.
Very much. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
It's nice to know that my work is being implemented, by people all around the world. It's a very gratifying feeling, really.
Oh, good. I'm glad and I'm grateful for you. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for spreading the word about all of this stuff.
That's good. That's what we're here for. I hope you found a few golden nuggety nuggets in the show today. Please don't press pause, but instead scroll on down on your podcast app. Yep, that's it, down there, and pop a review and maybe a few stars to make our eyes twinkle with glee. For more on breastfeeding and lactation content, head on over to my website where my course is. And for courses and books from Rachel, you can find everything in the links below. So all I gotta say now is, see you next time. And I can't wait.